Howdy and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is my driver rating for the Azerbaijan or Baku weekend, as this includes the sprint and the GP race, unlike the previous races which just have the GP race. This kind of combines them all together for this rating, as we didn't have those sprint races, so I didn't combine those for the previous ones, of course, but for this one it's all included. I start off at the back of the grid and work my way forward. Normally I work from the back of the finishing order for that weekend, but as I will switch this over to the driver standing to help just clarify a few things in this table per se. So I have the previous three races kind of a grayed out, and the one for this one is bold with the average at the very end. I will start off with the back, as I said, with Nick DeVries giving a 2. He struggled all weekend. Really couldn't get anything with that AlphaTauri, even crashing into his teammate during the race, knocking him out while he kind of struggled in that race at the end. So I couldn't give anything better than a 2. Logan Sargent, I gave a 4. He struggled all weekend, but he kind of was having issues himself without having issues with the rest of the grid. So just kind of keeping in there, but not quite that weekend for him, so a little bit below average for him. Kevin Magnussen, I gave a 7. Even though he qualified a little bit less than his teammate, he was able to push ahead of his teammate in both the sprint and the race, gaining 3 spots on the grid for that GP race at the very beginning and just working better in that car, even though he struggled at the very beginning of the weekend. So I gave a 7 for him. Alex Albon, I gave a 6. Just above average. He was kind of struggled, but was kind of showing fairly good with that Williams over his teammate, and was just a little bit better overall in the weekend. So I gave a 6 over that. Yuki, I gave an 8. He kind of did fairly well, even though he kind of didn't show it that well in this race, that qualifying session for the sprint, and kind of ended up in that back because of some other issues that he had. But I thought he was doing fairly well overall this weekend, even with his teammate kind of taking him that front wing out, which caused him to wreck during the GP. So I kind of gave him an 8. That may be a little bit high, but we will see. If you disagree, please give me a comment. Juan Yuzhou, I gave a 5. Pretty much average race for him. He outqualified his teammate, outdid his teammate, but was still not that shiny in that Alfa Romeo, but did a fairly good job, even though he didn't finish the GP race because of issues with that car. So an average race for him. Pierre Gasly, I gave a 7. He did fairly well, getting ahead of his teammate for most of those things. Was able to gain some spots on the GP race, kind of working his way through, but was not as grand as some of the other cars. But that Alpine was not looking that great this weekend in general. So, but I think he got a above average out of that vehicle. Same thing with his teammate Ocon. They kind of like swap positions a little bit, and with Ocon actually starting off in those hards in the GP race and going to the very last before pitting on that mandatory pit stop, causing that controversy in the pit lane with people gathering for the podium. But overall, I think he did a fairly good job in that Alpine, giving him a 7. Bottas had a horrible weekend. I gave a 3. He struggled, and even though he, didn't do as good as a teammate in some regards, he just could not handle that Alfa Romeo in this race. I think he should have been better in this, as he struggled at being the veteran for that team. I think he should have had a better weekend overall. So I gave a 3. Oscar Piastri, I gave a 6. Coming out a little bit above average, even though he came out just behind his teammate. I think he did fairly good in that McLaren, getting into that 10th position for the sprint race, even though it was just outside of points, and coming back into the 11th position for the GP race. So not quite making it into the point range, but overall a pretty good run from him. So I gave him a 6. That gives us to the top 10 standings, with Nico Hulkenberg. I gave a 5. He did pretty good in the sprint, coming back in that qualifying position, but dropping back in that actual race. Did a pretty bad job in the GP qualifying, but due to that strategy, couldn't hang on like Ocon could on those tires. So it's pretty much an average race for him, where he couldn't really get anything more out of that vehicle, but maybe he could have shined a little bit better if there was a different strategy that he could have pulled out. I don't know. Average race. Lando Norris, I gave a 7. I think he did a fairly good job. He outdid his teammate, even though he couldn't quite pull it in at the end for most of those, though getting that spot point for that 9th position in the GP race. Did a fairly good job with that McLaren, even though it did better than his teammate, so I gave it a 7. Lance Stroll was kind of the same way, in the sense that he was hanging on with his teammate. I gave a 7 because he couldn't quite hang with Alonso in the races, but he did overall a fairly good job in that Aston Martin. I showed that he gained 2 spots in the GP race start and was able to do some maneuvering, but just not quite where Alonso was, even though Alonso was giving him some advice on some settings during the GP race. But above average. George, I gave it 8. I think he did fairly good. He qualified, 4th in that sprint and made it to that same position for the end of that race with those top runners. He did a little bit poorer on the qualifying in the GP race, but was able to make it to 8th, even though his teammate made it to 6th, who made up some of those grounds. So overall, I think he did a fairly good job and even gained 2 spots on the GP start. So I gave him an 8. Charles, I gave a 9. I thought he did fairly good, almost perfect for that Ferrari. He, of course, got pole for both the sprint race and the GP race, but wasn't able to quite hang on to that and just kind of dropped back in that field a little bit, outdoing his teammate. So in that regard, he did really good and clawing his way back up. I just couldn't quite give the perfect score on that due to some of those issues that he was having in that race. Carlos, I gave a little bit of average because I think that Ferrari was still having some trouble, but he was way behind on his teammate, so I couldn't quite rank him up there, and he was struggling the weekend more than Charles was. So a 6 for him. A 7 for Lewis, as he kind of clawed his way back into that front runner spots, kind of mixed with his teammate, but is able to, in the races, kind of come out in that more the better positions than he started off with in the qualifying. So I gave a 7 in general for Lewis. Fernando, I gave an 8. I think he did fairly good with those DRS issues, kind of helping his teammate out. Just overall above average, but not the greatest that we've seen this season from those Aston Martins. So just an 8 for him. Sergio got a 9, almost perfect, except for the fact that he couldn't quite get the pole positions, and he lost it out from his teammate as well on one of those. But once he got to that lead, he was able to hang on and win that GP race and come into second on the sprint race. So it did a fairly good job for that. Actually, I guess, he won the sprint race as well, but came in from second instead of that first. So almost a perfect score, but not quite. Max Verstappen, just behind his teammate. I couldn't rate him as high as his teammate because he was qualified below his teammate on both of those, even though he gained that top position on the GP race, then dropped back because of the pit and the safety car issues that he had. Couldn't quite make his way back up, but just right behind his teammate in that point, so I gave him an 8. That basically concludes my standings. If you have different standings, you're welcome to give those in the comments, or if you wanted to argue with me on if I gave too high or too low, you can do that as well. If you made it this far, if you could give a like to this video or subscribe if you want to see something of mine on my ratings from the Miami race that's coming up this weekend. I would appreciate it. Until then, I will see you on the grid. Farewell.